Okay, Daniel chapter 6. And calling this little rap Darius's Dark Night of the Soul. All right, so this is a chapter that's generally taught from the point of view of Daniel. But I think that it has some really interesting value for us looked at from the point of view of Darius. And I think that the reasons for that will become clear as we work our way through this thing. If you've been with us through this study of Daniel, you have probably figured out by now that the first 6 chapters of this 12-chapter book, they're like narratives. Okay, they're about things that have happened in the life of Daniel and his friends. And so these people, these boys, have been deported from Jerusalem as the nation of Judah was laid to waste by the Babylonians. Daniel was a teenager when all that happened. And the narrative portion that we're doing this morning takes place a long time after this book started. Daniel's at least 80 years old at this point. And he's lived a very long life under circumstances that are, they're no dream life for any observant Jewish teenager to have been dropped into. All right, and so that kind of means that there are some really important lessons for us about what a life of faith looks like, and also about what a God is like that's involved in human history in circumstances that aren't ideal. And so these are themes that have come up over and over again in this book as we've been going through it and around it and all that kind of stuff. And so the narrative portion of this book ends this morning with Daniel chapter 6. And when we pick up next week with chapters 7 and 8, we're going to be getting into the prophecies that Daniel's receiving from God during this entire time that he's in, outside of Israel in exile. And see, these prophecies that we're going to get into are so specific that I really think that they're capable of providing a real basis, a foundation almost, for you to believe that the God of the Bible is real and that he can be known. So the prophecy portions of this book are very cool, but we're not doing that today. Starts next week. This morning, we're doing chapter 6, and we're going to try and finish the narrative portion. And so I've chopped it up a little bit into the chunks that make up the narrative. Daniel is like, especially for a Bible writer, he's like an excellent writer, okay? He has a real sense of being able to tell the story accurately and somewhat dramatically, all right? And so he starts this chapter by giving us the setting, and actually I guess that it starts at the very end of chapter 5, and it says that Darius the Mede received the kingdom at about 62 years old. He appointed 120 satraps over the kingdom, and over them he appointed 3 commissioners, of whom Daniel was one. They were accountable directly to the king. Daniel distinguished himself from the other commissioners and satraps because he had an extraordinary spirit, and the king planned to appoint him over the entire kingdom. All right, so there's our background. All right, this is the setting that Daniel gives us for this story that's going to take place. And he introduces us to this new guy, Darius, right? Darius the Mede. And so we saw in our study in chapter 5, not last week, but the week before, that the Babylonian Empire came to an end in 539 BC. When they were overrun by the combined armies of the Medes and the Persians. And so now the city of Babylon is part of a different empire that's even larger than the Babylonian Empire had been. So this is the Medo-Persian Empire. And Darius, who is apparently ethnically a Mede, is the first king. And so outside the Bible, the historical record on this part is like a little bit unclear, because the first king of the Persian Empire was Cyrus. And so it is possible that Darius the Mede is an ethnic name for Cyrus the Persian. Okay, so that would make them one and the same individual, kind of like the Babylonians called Daniel Belteshazzar, right? Like that was his Babylonian name, but Daniel's his Hebrew name, and so it's not at all uncommon in the ancient world for different language groups to have different names and different titles for the same person. Okay, and so I tend to go with the fact that Darius and Cyrus are the same person. And the level of specificity given here makes it kind of clear that Daniel's not just retelling some old legend, okay, as some have put forward that that's the case here. He's telling history as it has unfolded and as he has witnessed it. And so Darius, just like the Babylonians before him, would set up regional offices all throughout the empire for the collection of taxes and to administer the law. And there's usually a military function to these things also. And the people that took care of all that kind of stuff were called satraps. And that's not a very common word for us today, but there it is. All right, and that's what it means. And over these 120 satraps, there are 3 like super administrators. All right, Daniel's one of those 3. So he has a very, very high level of authority within this Medo-Persian empire that we're talking about. And our little introduction here tells us that Daniel was an extraordinary man with an extraordinary spirit. Okay, so there's something that Darius recognized in Daniel, as had all of the Babylonian emperors before him, that he's just like a special guy. And so he's able to give wisdom into various situations. He has like a keen insight. He's basically just like a very value-added kind of guy to have around. And this is so true that as this is towards the end of Darius's life as well, and he wants to entrust his kingdom to people that are going to take good care of it, this says that the king planned to appoint him over the entire kingdom. All right, so think about that for a second. There's 120 regional bureaucrats, and then there are these 2 other super bureaucrats, and out of all those people, it's Daniel that's chosen by the king to be over all of them, kind of as the next king, or at least as a regent or something to hold it in trust. I don't really know what his plan was, but there's no doubt that this creates in these other officials a sense of jealousy, okay, and that maybe this whole thing isn't quite fair. All right, they're all jockeying for position, and Daniel's kind of in the way. And so here the narrative moves into what's going to be the real plot. Okay, he set the foundation, he gave us a setting for what's going to happen in the story, and now it's time to really tell what happens in the story. And so it goes like this. It says, "Then the commissioners and satraps sought grounds of accusation against Daniel regarding his administration. But since he was faithful, they could find no evidence of corruption. Then they said, the only accusation we will find against Daniel will be with regard to his way of faith in his God." It says, "Then the commissioners and satraps came by agreement to the king and spoke the following: King Darius, live forever. All the commissioners and the satraps in the kingdom have consulted together, except Daniel, okay, that the king should establish a statute and enforce an injunction that anyone who makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days, shall be cast into the lion's den." So imagine you're Darius, okay? You're a little bit old. Your power is waning slightly, at least. The level of respect that you command is not quite what it once was. And you're a little bit more vulnerable than you're used to being. And your goons show up one day with an idea. that, you be the only one that anybody can recognize essentially as a god, even for a short period of time. Okay? So the idea kind of strokes his ego a little bit, and he's flattered that these goons would want to honor him this way and revere him like a god. And so Darius is moved by all this nonsense, and he agrees to it. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so it will not be changed, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which may not be revoked. All right, so this becomes an important point in the story. Darius signs this decree that no one can pray to any god but him for 30 days, and it says that that is according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which may not be revoked. So once the document is signed, it's binding for everyone, including the king himself. So there are no exceptions. This is universally binding. And so you'll notice, if you're reading this with any kind of care, that there's a certain drama starting to build. And so on one hand, there's this jealousy-driven plan that strokes the emperor's ego. And on the other hand, there is this total lack of foresight on the part of the emperor as it relates to signing this ridiculous document that binds everyone in the kingdom, including himself, to worshiping him only for 30 days. Right? See that? So now we get to see how this unfolds. The trap is set. It's about to be sprung. It says, when Daniel knew the document was signed, he entered his house and went to the roof, which had a chamber with a window directed to Jerusalem. He prayed on his knees 3 times a day, praying and giving thanks before his God, as he always did. Then certain men came as they had agreed to do and found Daniel in prayer. So clearly these guys have been spying on Daniel for a while. Okay, they knew about Daniel's faith. They knew that he's pretty serious about this whole God thing. And in watching Daniel, they've found a way to derail this guy and just really get him completely taken out of the picture. Okay, he prays with regularity 3 times a day, up on his roof, in a chamber with a window towards Jerusalem. Okay, so they know that at certain times of the day, Daniel's up there doing his thing. And they come in right at one of those points. So Daniel's busted. Then verse 12 says, then they went to the king, saying, did you not sign an injunction that anyone who makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days, is to be cast into the lion's den? The king replied, the statement is true, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which may not be revoked. Then these officials said, Daniel, who's one of the exiles from Judah, pays no heed to you, O king, or your injunction, but keeps praying to his God. So now we have a problem. All right, Daniel's a man that is very highly valued by the king. And he's been found in violation of the king's irrevocable and universal edict. And so this precipitates for Darius what I think this whole story is really about. Okay, this is the crisis. This is the dark night of Darius's soul. And this is how it goes. Then the king became deeply distressed and set his mind on delivering Daniel. And even until sunset, he kept exerting himself to that end. All right, this is his best guy. And he's about to have to throw him in the lion's den according to the law that he himself just signed. And so he's trying to juke around a little bit. Okay, he's meeting with his lawyers and trying to find a way around all this thing. He's looking for a loophole or an exception clause of some kind so that he can protect this asset and possibly his friend, that's Daniel. Okay, it turns out that that doesn't really work for him. It says, then the king ordered Daniel to be brought in and cast into the lion's den. The king spoke, saying to Daniel, your God, whom you constantly serve, will deliver you. It sounds to me like he's just kind of hoping. You know what I mean? And then, this is the amazing part. Then the king went off to his palace and spent the night fasting. No entertainment was brought before him, and his sleep fled from him. So this is the part, right, that indicates that this is a dark night of the soul for Darius. This guy basically views himself as a god. Other people are petitioning him as if he were a god. And yet, if he's a god, he's just come face to face with the fact that he is not an all-powerful God. Right? He hasn't been able to protect his best administrator from the other administrators. He's forced to throw this guy into the lion's den. And so Darius is like putting all this together in his mind, and he's unable to sleep. Okay? What is it that's keeping this guy awake at night? Right? Well, one thing has to be the guilt that he must have felt over sentencing what he knew to be an innocent man to death. Okay, Darius has done an extremely foolish thing here by signing this stupid decree, right? He's made it so that a good and innocent and competent man is guilty of a capital crime. All right, and so the important point here is that, you know, some of us may have experienced some kind of dark night of the soul ourselves. Okay, you may have come to a place where reality is just sort of closing in on you, and the things that you have suppressed and that you try to keep out of your mind all of a sudden become unavoidable for you and disturbing to you. And so guilt is one of those things that can do that. And Darius is realizing that the cost of his pride is being paid by another person. All right, it was his pride that made him sign the decree, made him want to be treated like a god. And who's paying the price for that? Well, Daniel, this guy that doesn't really have anything to do with that. And, you know, this is not unique to Darius. Okay, it's not unique that he made this prideful decision and that unintended consequences begin to happen to people that he cares about. Okay, the same thing happens with us. And so, like, what is the cost of your pride? Who is it that pays the cost for your pride? And so maybe it's hurtful things that you say in anger, okay, the things that sting and stay with that other person, maybe forever. Okay, there are many of us here probably that can remember things that were said to us decades ago. Okay, they cut and they left a scar, and that became a source of like accusation in our heart. And that thing sort of encapsulates the fears and the insecurities that we have about ourselves. And so I'm guilty of that. And you probably are too. And a lot of us as parents have said things to our children that we deeply regret. Okay, maybe we even realize it as soon as it comes out of our mouths. But you can't take it back. All right, it's too late. The damage is done. And it is our pride and it is our insensitivity that does that damage. And other people pay for our pride. Okay, we also have these chronic attitudes that are rooted in our pride that we pass on to the people that we care about. So maybe it's your attitudes about authority, or your attitude about material affluence, or things of the ego that must be protected and defended at all costs. And we often don't realize that we're subtly passing these things on to people that we care about. Okay, the things that we struggle with and that make us hard to live with and hard to deal with become the very things that our children struggle with and that make them hard to be with. So that's exactly why the Bible says that the sins of the father are passed to the son to the third generation. Okay, it's just the way it is. We're prideful people. Other people end up paying the price for our pride. And so Darius is right at this moment becoming aware that this is exactly the case. Okay, some of us are so driven professionally and by ego pursuits of all sorts that we come to a place where we have really nothing of substance to offer to another person in their time of need. Okay, someone else could be relying on us, but we're really just not there for them anymore. We're not able to deliver for them because we're so occupied in our own world that we barely even notice anything else. Okay, so they're paying the price for our pride. And in our honest moments, we realize that this is the way that we are. Okay, in the dark night of the soul, we reflect in a somewhat sensitive way. We don't really have anything to distract us. Just sort of alone with our thoughts and our memories, and we can hear that still small voice asking us about these certain things. Okay, these unresolved things. And we live in a culture that tells us that the things that we do are kind of on our own time and are just for us. Okay, and we really just need to leave each other alone. Okay, we really don't understand the deep connectedness of human society and of family. Other people really are made to pay the unintended consequences of your pride. Okay, and Darius is sitting there face to face with that right now. He's realizing a couple of other things probably that are keeping him awake. Dude, the people that he had trusted duped him, right? And he's angry about that. He's watching Daniel get lowered into the lion's den, and you know he's got to be thinking that these guys just totally screwed him. He trusted these guys, and he got caught up in his ego, and these guys played him like a fiddle. And we don't actually need to speculate to know how furious about this he was. You're going to see what happens at the end of the story. Okay, but the thing that really comes out in this narrative and is a part of the broader story in the book of Daniel is that Darius, just like all the Babylonian rulers before him, was really provoked by the unique spirit that Daniel had. Okay, that was said pretty explicitly at the beginning of this narrative. It actually talked about Daniel's unique spirit that attracted the trust of the people that were around him. Okay, but what was it about Daniel's spirit? Okay, what was the thing that was going on in his life that produced this level of trust in him by other people? Well, the text brought our attention to three specific things. And the first is his deep and unyielding prayer life. Okay, in fact, ultimately, it's his prayer life that gets him into trouble here, right? And thrown in the lion's den. But look at what it says. It says, when Daniel knew the edict was signed, he continued kneeling 3 times a day, praying and giving thanks before his God, as he did previously. Okay, there are some things in this little statement that really indicate what kind of a man Daniel was. Okay, the first one of these things that we're going to look at here is that when Daniel knew that the edict was signed, he just continued right on praying. Okay, and the way that this story is told, it draws our attention to Daniel's prayer and the edict not to pray. And what this is really saying about Daniel is that he knows that God is still God. It doesn't really matter what Darius or the satraps or the administrators or anyone else thinks. Okay, God is still God. God is sovereign. And at this stage of Daniel's life, he has already been the agent through which God has revealed these like incredible and specific visions about the whole course of human history right down to the end. And so Daniel is aware of the work of God in history and where everything is going. And so therefore he can hear that there's been this edict signed, and he can totally just not give a rip. All right? Daniel knows exactly who's in charge. And so like if your dog wants to go for a walk, but you've got something important that you're dealing with, it just doesn't matter how much noise the dog makes. Okay? There's something that's actually important going on. And so God is God. And it makes no difference what the voices are saying around you. Right? Or even what the weird voices in your own head say about the way that things are. Okay? The only thing that matters is what God has said. And so when Daniel heard that this edict was signed, he figured that was probably going to be a problem. Okay, but he's going to go ahead and he's going to do his thing anyway, just like he always had. And that gives rise to a second and very important thought about this, and that is that certainly in this context, but I would think that this is always true, prayer is an act of rebellion. Okay? Prayer is an act of sedition against the world system that stands in opposition to God. Okay, so David Wells has an article that I have cited maybe 20 or 30 times in this setting, but I don't think that you could say this too many times, especially since we seem to forget it so quickly. This is the single most articulate and helpful statement on prayer that I have ever seen. Okay, petitionary prayer is when we're praying for people and things that we're concerned about, all right? And so he says, prayer is rebellion against the world in its fallenness, the absolute and undying refusal to accept as normal what is pervasively abnormal. Petitionary prayer is the expression of the hope that life as we meet it can be otherwise, and on the other hand, that it ought to be otherwise. Prayer is a protest against a world that is very far from God. Okay, a world that's ruled by spiritual beings and human beings that oppose the purposes of God and who place themselves in the place of God. And prayer is our acknowledgement that there is a sovereign of the universe. Okay, and that sovereign is God, not us. It's his will and his purpose that's going to prevail in the end. Okay, I pray as an act of defiance that the world as we experience it is not as it should be. Okay, and Wells uses the word fallen here. And so he means that God's intent and God's purpose for humanity has been distorted by our own sinfulness and our own rebellion against God. Okay, fallen from an exalted place where we had open access to God. And now we're left as free creatures in an environment that's temporarily guided by the excesses of our own free will. It's not normal. Okay, that's not the world that God intended. And prayer is a protest against the world system as it is. Okay, and Wells goes on to say that it is impossible to seek to live in God's world on his terms, doing his work in a way that is consistent with who he is without engaging in regular prayer. This just crushes me every time I read it. Okay? Why can we not get this? Why can I not get this? Prayer is our way to approach God and agree with him on his take on the world. Okay? Our heart is broken as his is broken by the fallenness and the suffering and the alienation that does exist. And God has called his people to be his instrument, an instrument on his behalf to effect his purpose of reaching out to this fallen and corrupt world and the people that are caught up in it. Okay, prayer is a way that we're able to access the mind of God and the leading of God and to move towards people with a different kind of message. And so there's a way that the world works, but God has got something else. All right, God has something better. God has grace for us. And God wants to reach out to the people that we care about and the people that we are petitioning God on their behalf with a message of reconciliation with him. Okay, this is the Christian message. This is the biblical message. God pursues, God loves, God's calling us back to himself to be reconciled into a relationship with him. Okay, and he's even provided the basis under which we can be reconciled to him. Okay, and it's not by being more religious, all right, or doing the right thing or being more pious, but by receiving this gift that God's wanting to give us. Okay, it's the gift of forgiveness. That's what God is putting forth right here this morning. And so maybe you're investigating churches or Christianity. Maybe someone totally dragged you here this morning. All right, you're just stuck here for an hour. Well, this is it. Okay? No one is suggesting that you become more religious or that you join this club or whatever. All right, it's just that you recognize that there's like a flow to this world and you're kind of caught up in it. Okay, and that flow has got you sort of spiraling out of God's orbit. And God is calling you back to him. Okay, he wants a relationship with you. He wants you to be forgiven. And he wants a real thing going on with you that goes on forever. And so he's asking you on the basis of the death of Christ, which pays for the sins of humanity, to just trust in that sacrifice and ask that it count for you. And then, on the basis of what he did, and not on the basis of how good we are, we're able to have real standing before God. Okay, so that's the message, both Old Testament and New Testament, of what it means to be reconciled to God. Okay, and the prayer of God's people is an important part of getting that message out. All right, so this says that Daniel prayed 3 times a day. Means that this guy is leading a pretty structured life. All right, it's a disciplined life. And this starts to get to the idea that in some ways prayer is a work, right? It is a labor. It's not something that you just do real quick before you eat or as you're drifting off to sleep at night. 3 times a day, on his knees, directed toward Jerusalem. This dude is working it. All right, but the point here is consistent with what we see in the rest of Scripture and consistent with what we see in the history of God working. All right, whenever there are significant things that God has happening within that group of people, there are people that are deeply and consistently committed to the work of prayer. Okay, James says that the earnest prayer of a righteous person can accomplish much. We can get a lot done this way. All right, or like Jesus says, always pray and never give up. All right, and so there's this idea here that God's people are called to have a regular thing going on with God. And so maybe you're one of us here that's wishing that you could sense and experience a little bit more of God in your life. Okay, you're looking for more of the reality of Him and the power of Him and a personal connection with Him. Maybe you're kind of wishing that your life was having a greater impact on the world for the things of God. Maybe you're frustrated that things are not really moving in that direction. All right, well, let me suggest something. Okay, why don't you try pulling a Daniel? Okay, why don't you deliberately set aside moments of your day that are specifically for the purpose of prayer? And I'll push that just a little bit further. I double dog dare you. Try this. Multiple times in a day, turn your attention to God and pray for specific petitions, for things that He has placed on your heart. I mean specific people that He has brought into your life so that, you can serve them and be a light to them, and, things that are important to you in your own personal life. Pray daily for these things. Write them down and remember them and go back to them. And the truth is that you will look back over several months and realize that you have not been talking to empty space. Okay? You have been consistently bringing these things before God, and God is actually moving in these very areas. All right, this is very powerful. And here's the thing, the reason that we feel that we're not really sensing the work of God in our lives is because we're not even really addressing Him. Okay, most of us are sure not addressing Him in the way that Daniel's describing here. Okay, if someone keeps talking about how hungry they are, and you suggest that maybe they should eat something, but they just don't really feel like eating, or they feel like they shouldn't have to eat, or whatever weird thing they have to say in the way of response. It's like, whatever, dude. All right? But this is analogous to the way that we are about prayer. Okay, and Daniel's just putting this out there, right? Like, if we're consistent and we're disciplined in this area of our lives, we're going to be able to see God at work. The earnest prayers of righteous people can accomplish much. There's that. So thirdly, this says about Daniel's prayer life that he's all about giving thanks to God. And so this is tied to the fact that Daniel knows who his God is, right? He's 80 plus years old now, and he's had this long history of addressing God daily. And this communication has become very personal. Daniel knows his God. And because of the visions that he's had of the future, he certainly knows what his God is going to do. And so even in this present crisis, he's able to give thanks to God. The answer to the problem of the suffering that Daniel's about to face is not in worrying about what's going to happen to him. Okay? It is in being concerned with whose hands his life is in. All right, Daniel knows God, and he knows whose hands his life is in. And so even before the arrest is made and he's thrown into the lion's den, he's able to thank God. Okay, mature biblical faith always includes this element of gratitude. Okay, it's a statement of trust. It means that you believe that God is a good God and that, he's a father in heaven that loves you as his child. It means that you trust and you believe that the things that God allows to occur in your life do not define your life, and they're not the things that ultimately break you. In fact, God will even use those things to affect his purposes in your life and through your life to other people. Okay? Daniel's able to totally rest in that reality. Next thing here about Daniel's spirit is that Darius is undoubtedly provoked by Daniel's humility and the fact that he's like this very straightforward person. Daniel's kind of a no BS kind of guy. Okay, we've seen this repeatedly as we've been going through this book. In 6:21, Daniel says, "O king, live forever." So there's a respect that Daniel communicates that he has for this guy. There's humility that Daniel has in the place that he's in. And in chapter 4, verse 19, Daniel says, "My Lord, if only the dream applied to those who hate you and its interpretation to your enemies." But unfortunately, it applies to you, right? And the point here is that even under the rule of this ruthless man that he's talking to in chapter 4, Daniel stood there in front of him with humility. And he was honest. He was straightforward. He told people what was up. He wasn't afraid of telling them what was really going to happen, but he spoke the truth with a level of humility that enabled people to hear the hard thing that he was saying. And many of us have a very hard time in this area. Okay, we sometimes do not say hard things because we lack the humility to do it in a gracious way, so we just don't do it. Others of us do not mind saying hard things, but we don't do it with any humility, and so we can't be heard. All right, our delivery is too offensive for it to make any difference at all. Okay, doesn't matter that what we're saying is true. Nobody can hear us. And so Daniel has got this sort of positive view of these people, and he's able to be humble and tell them what the truth is. Okay, would that we could speak the truth in love to one another, like Daniel does. Lastly here, Darius and all these other emperors before him in Babylon looked at Daniel and they saw that his intent was to work for the good of the empire, okay, or the good of the city as we called it at the beginning of this study, the book of Daniel. It says that Daniel distinguished himself among the commissioners. The king planned to appoint him over the entire kingdom. That's because the king trusted him. He understood that Daniel's intention was good, and we should be working for the good of our city as well. Okay, the Christian community is not supposed to be an isolated island of irrelevance, okay, that's cut off from everyone else. And the things that I am most proud of about our little church are things that where we are reaching out and interacting with the community and our value added in those situations. Okay, thank you for the things that you all do in those areas. But here's this guy, Darius, and he's realizing that he's carrying this guilt for the death of an innocent man. And he's angry because he's been misled by the people that he trusted. And he's provoked by this powerful spiritual example of Daniel, right? And he's having a rough night. And then the story moves to the resolution. Okay, and so here's how it all wraps up. It says, the king arose at dawn, the break of day, and went in haste to the lion's den. When he came near the den, he cried out with a troubled voice, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you constantly serve, been able to deliver you from the lions? Then Daniel spoke to the king, O king, live forever. my God sent his angel to shut the lions' mouths. That is cool, right? And then, after Darius got his revenge on his former administration by throwing them and their wives and their children and the horse that they rode in on all into the lion's den, it says, then Darius the king wrote to all the peoples, nations, and men of every language living in the land, may your peace abound. I make a decree that in my whole kingdom everyone is to fear and tremble before the God of Daniel. Right? This is in direct juxtaposition to the decree that set himself up as king and God. All right? And so he's now recognizing the authority of the real God. And so this is amazing what he says. This is not from the mouth of a person that doesn't know God. So Darius is not Jewish, right? Like, this guy doesn't know God. He's Persian. And it says, he is the living God and endures forever. His kingdom will never be destroyed. He delivers and rescues and performs signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He has also delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. So something very powerful has taken place in the life of Darius. All right. The first part of the resolution of this story is that Darius comes to terms with God. Okay, in that tough night where he's processing all these things, Darius comes to terms with God. And when he's thinking about all of the things that he knows about this God through the example of Daniel, and when he's trying to figure out where to put his guilt, something clicked. Okay, at some point during that night, and confirmed by Daniel being alive in the morning, Darius comes to a turning place. The language changes. Okay, it's no longer the God of Daniel. Now it's the God of heaven that Darius is appealing to, and Darius is recognizing. Darius the Mede came to know the living God. Okay, so what about you? Do you know the living God? And have you ever experienced a dark night of the soul? Have you come to terms with where you are in reality in relation to God? Not your terms, God's terms. Have you humbled yourself? Right? That's what Darius did. He admitted that God was God. All right? And that's a decision that we all need to make. It's not something that you absorb from your church or from your parents. Okay, it's a decision. You choose to trust the living God. We acknowledge our guilt, we acknowledge our alienation from him, and we choose to trust his provision for that guilt in the person of Jesus Christ. Okay, so that's what it looks like to come to terms with God. And if we're prepared to humble ourselves in that way, then he is super excited to demonstrate his love to you. Okay, and indwelling you with the Spirit, confirming you. That's just like he's your heavenly Father. Okay, the second thing in terms of resolution to this story is the effect of Daniel's provocative faith. Okay, how did Darius get to the place where he can't sleep and he's wrestling with God? Okay, it's because of this persistent witness of Daniel. Okay, and God has placed you as a Daniel for a whole bunch of the people around you. Okay, to live openly and truly and honestly in front of them. To pray for them. Okay, to be the bridge between time and eternity for them. Okay, it's incredible to have the privilege and the opportunity to have your life be used in a way that has eternal significance in the life of other people. Okay, you just have to think about you know, a guy like Daniel that has this encounter with the most powerful man in the world, and he watches as his God triumphs. Right, this would be a great and powerful confirming experience for Daniel also. Okay, and it's always the byproduct of our desire to pursue God that we come more and more to witness his power and more sure that he is in control. Okay, so the last thing is that this would be a pretty cool moment for the Jewish people in exile. Okay, to be able to see that their God, who has allowed them to be taken into exile, is still God. Okay, he hasn't been vanquished by the Babylonians or the Persians. This is just another example to them that theirs is the God of heaven, as the book of Daniel keeps saying. Okay, and the same is true for us. Regardless of our moment in time and the circumstances that we face, there is a God in heaven. Okay, and he's our God. He's our Father, and we're under his compassionate care. Okay, so that's Daniel chapter 6. These 6 chapters have been very cool for getting us to think about, I think, who God is and what it looks like for him to work through people's lives in circumstances that are not ideal. I've enjoyed it. And we start the prophecy parts next week. That's a wild ride, but it's a little bit like studying the end times, so that's cool. That's all I have for this morning. If you have anything you